Good day, good evening, whatever time it is in your part of the world. This is Geechee Lion's Journey, and this is going to be beginning of a series. I'm going to feature my favorite musical groups and artists from my over 60 years of experience in listening to music. Today, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite bands growing up, and this was inspired for me to do this today because of a vlog that someone did on their channel talking about the group that I'm about to talk to right now. If you're looking at the slideshow, you know what group I'm talking about, and that's Chicago. Chicago as a group, I think officially started or was formed in the late 60s. According to Wikipedia, it said 1967. I wouldn't have become aware of them until 69 when they first came out with their first single, which was, I believe, Beginnings, aptly titled. The first album of theirs was actually called Chicago Transit Authority, and that was going to be the name of their group, but I guess they decided they didn't want any naming conflict with the actual Chicago Transit Authority, which actually dealt with the rapid transit there, buses, trains, and what have you. So they just, for the second album, they shortened the name to just Chicago. The band started out 7 original members that I should know very well. Of course, we're talking about Robert Lamb, Peter Cetera, Terry Kath, Danny Serafin, Lee Loughnane, James Pankow, and Walter Perizzator. One of the most distinctive things about this group, Chicago, was it was a band, even though they played rock and roll, I guess, as a base, but they also played jazz. And the sound was really built on their horn section. I would say that the Chicago horn section is probably one of the best that was ever assembled. I mean, obviously, there's some other ones I can mention that were pretty good, like Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and also, of course, the famous Phoenix horns of Earth, Wind, and Fire, which you could probably arguably say they were the best. But I was a 10 or 11-year-old boy. I guess I would have had to be 10 years old in 69 when I first heard this group, Chicago. And again, I heard Beginnings, and does anybody really know what time it is? And the Chicago Transit Authority album was one of the first albums that I ever purchased with my own money. And those days, we just had vinyl LP, so you had to have an actual record player. So I actually played this record on a record player. And other memorable tunes on that first album was, of course, I'm a Man, which was recorded by Spencer Davis Group featuring Steve Winwood. I'm a Man was on there as well. That was also a very classic sound. And the guitar playing of Terry Kath was very distinctive. As a matter of fact, Jimi Hendrix even called Terry Kath his favorite lead guitarist. And that's saying something when Jimi Hendrix would give you that type of promo. But I had no arguments with that because the early sound of Chicago with their original group of seven was absolutely classical, magical. They represented the highest in musicianship with the horn arrangements, the guitar playing of Terry Cass, the vocals of Peter Cetera, as well as Bobby Lamb in the beginning, and the fire drumming of Mr. Danny Seraphim as well. So I go back and was talking about that very first album. Right after that, the next album, which was released the very next year in 1970. They did a first album came out April of 69. They came out 8 months later, January of 1970, with another double album. This is the other thing. Their first 3 albums were double albums. So we're talking about Chicago 2 right now. That album featured the single Make Me Smile, which is really a snippet of a longer song about a ballad to, I think it's called Ballad for a Girl in Buchanan. Make Me Smile was actually an edit, a couple of minute edit from that full length masterpiece. I think it still was just as commercially successful as Transit Authority, but it only had that one hit. It had Make Me Smile, and that's it. Even though, again, it was full of other good songs on there as well. And then right after that, the very next year, 1 year later, another double album, Chicago 3. Now, Chicago 3, if I remember right, that had a couple of songs on there. The hits from there was Free. I just want to be free. That one. And then they released Lowdown. Lowdown wasn't really much of a hit as Free was, but those were the 2 designated singles. Again, Chicago 3, what I remember about that, there was a song on there called The Approaching Storm. And one of the local Chicago TV stations used The Approaching Storm as their theme song for one of their programs. But that was Chicago, an instrumental off the album Chicago 3, another double album. Another great album, I would say. The 4th album, which was released during the same year, 71, it was just a live album. I think it was three LPs, I believe. But it was all just live versions of the songs they had done before. There might have been a couple of additions, but it was basically just a live album. Which I ended up getting that, of course. And then they wouldn't release an album of new material until 1972 with Chicago 5. And I remember that very well. Chicago 5, it was just a single album. It wasn't a double. But this one has Saturday in the Park and Dialogue. Part 1 and Part 2, which featured vocals by Terry Cass and Peter Cetera, alternating. That was another great album, smash album again. The musicianship solid with the horn section, the guitar of Terry Cass, the drummer of Danny Seraphim. Very solid. You have Bobby Lamb on the lead vocals for Saturday in the Park as well. And then Chicago 6. At that time, they just had put the albums in numerical order. Chicago 6 came out the next year, single album again in June of 73. And I remember that distinctly because the main hit off of that was Feeling Stronger Every Day. That was the first time, and I guess, no, that was the first time I saw the group Chicago with the original members. And actually, that was the only time I saw them. I saw them again later, but I'll talk about that. So I actually walked to the Chicago Stadium to see them because they actually performed walking distance from where I was staying at the time in 1973. I was staying on the west side of Chicago, which was about a mile, less than 2 miles from Chicago Stadium. And I saw that group live, and of course, they did not disappoint. Great musicianship, solid performance, live. Very good. And again, this was one of my favorite musical groups at the time. The very next year, they were putting out a lot of music. The very next year, they returned back to the double album, Chicago 7. And this one I remember very distinctively because they featured the Beach Boys, another very popular group. I won't call them a super group, but they were a group very popular in the 60s and 70s. They did I've Been Searching So Long on that album, and Wishing You Were Here. And also Call on Me. You can call on me, baby, which basically featured Peter Cetera. Double album again, and they added a new member of percussionist Laudir de Oliveira, he would actually join the group at that point. Chicago 7, another great double album. The next year, 1975, they put out Chicago 8. And it wasn't that great of a commercial success. It was a step down for me. There's a song on there called Old Days. They had a couple other singles, but they're not memorable. But I did buy that album, and again, it was satisfactory to me. A little letdown from the previous works, but it was still solid nonetheless. Chicago 9, which was actually just a greatest hits album, so I didn't bother buying that. That came out in 75. And then the new album of new material, Chicago 10, and that is where you started to see a shift in the sound of Chicago with the release of If You Lead Me Down, which was written by Peter Cetera. Peter Cetera also provided the lead vocals on that song. And that is where you started to see a shift, and a shift in sound and a shift in emphasis of the Chicago sound. And actually, If You Leave Me Now was the only hit on that album. I believe it was their first and maybe their only number one hit, If You Leave Me Now. But at that time, that album, that song marked a major shift in the sound of Chicago. They would do one more album together, the original members, Chicago 11, which came out in September 1977. I remember that one because it had Baby What a Big Surprise. And they also had one called Take Me Back to Chicago. I think Chaka Khan did a little background vocals on that. But that album marked the last album that would feature the lead guitarist and vocalist Terry Kath, because right after that album was produced, he committed suicide. I call it suicide, but he had a gun accident, shot himself in the head. And really, from that point on, that really marked, I almost want to say, the death of Chicago as we knew it, because he was the founding member and key to their sound. So that was obviously a very traumatic, major change to the group itself. And they would never be the same after that. And they say this particular song, it would make they would make the top 10 again until Chicago 16, which I'll talk about that. But after the departure of Terry Calf, they came out with a few not memorable albums. As a matter of fact, I did not buy these albums. They dropped off the face of the earth after Terry Calf died. They certainly didn't have any hits. They weren't promoted on the radio. They probably didn't tour as much. They put out this album called Hot Streets. I think ended up buying it, but maybe years later. And then Chicago 13 and Chicago 14. Neither one of those albums did I buy when they were new. So they were not memorable albums, but at that time, again, Peter Cetera was still with the group. I think Danny Seraphim was still with the group. I know he would be fired from the group, if you will, later on around that time. Which brings me to the album Chicago 16, which was a return to the top 10 for Chicago. And this was basically due to the influence of one of the most popular producers at that time, one of the most popular producers at that time, David Foster. And the big hit on that was Hard to Say I'm Sorry. Hard to Say I'm Sorry, again, along with Love Me Tomorrow. You had Peter Cetera out front. You didn't hear Bobby Lamb at all. He wasn't no longer in the group as a vocalist. It was all about Peter Cetera. Also, the horns, you only heard the horns in very specific spots. Like on Hard to Say I'm Sorry, they had the horn section at the end, which was like the ending of Hard to Say I'm Sorry. But let me now bring in a little bit of my perspective, what began to happen here with this album and the next album, Chicago 17, which was the last great as far as popularity, again, produced by David Foster and featuring Peter Cetera. This album included the monster classics. I'm in the Philippines. These two songs by Chicago are played to death in the Philippines. They're played to death. I'm talking about You're the Inspiration and Hard Habit to Break. Again, top 10 hits certainly featuring David Foster, Peter Cetera. It de-emphasized the horns, but these two songs are monster hits in the Philippines. So whoever wrote these songs, they are making millions of dollars, millions of dollars on royalties from these two records alone. They're playing them to death in the Philippines. And they're also some of the favorite songs that I like to sing karaoke and other people as well. But what began to happen here is the group began to split, and they did split during this period. Really, the split began with the death of Terry Calf and the shift in emphasis to Peter Cetera as basically a lead vocalist and a de-emphasis on the horns. I do notice that. When I listen to the albums, they certainly de-emphasize the horns. And I understand years ago when I looked at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when Chicago was inducted, Peter Cetera did not appear with them because obviously the differences, the feud between him and the other group members was too great. But the reason you had that problem was Peter Cetera was put out front almost to the exclusion of the other members. Again, you didn't hear Bobby Lamb's vocal anymore. The horns were de-emphasized. Of course, Terry Kath wasn't there. Danny Seraphim wasn't there. So by David Foster and Peter Cetera, basically they took over the group. And one way you take over the sound is you become the principal songwriter. And I can tell you this, what I've learned is the people who make the most money from music are the songwriters. If you're the original songwriter, you get the songwriting royalties. And then if you don't sign away your publishing, you get your publishing royalties. On top of that, Peter Cetera was the performer, lead vocalist. So he got paid for that. David Foster got paid for that because he was a songwriter and producer. So they made millions of dollars. While the other members, especially the horn section, their income was greatly decreased. And this is another thing I looked into. And there's been a lot of consternation and a lot of discussion about famous artists who are dissatisfied with the amount of money they made or received from royalties. So first thing I would ask, and I would just use Johnny Taylor as an aside, as an example here. I won't go into the detail. But his family was complaining about him not getting royalties. Well, the first question I would ask is, did he write any of his songs? Because if he didn't write any, he's not entitled to any songwriting royalties. He's not entitled to any publishing royalties. The only thing that he would be entitled to is if whatever was provided for in mechanical sales, whether that be downloads or physical CDs, cassettes, and vinyl albums. If he's supposed to get 8 cents, 10 cents, or whatever per sale or per download, that's where his royalties would have gone. Now, of course, he's been gone for almost 20 years, and from what I understand, his family hasn't been paid virtually anything. But again, I know find out this: if you did not write the song, and if you don't have the publishing royalties, you're not gonna get paid that much. It all depends on what the record deal involved as far as mechanics, which is another thing they came up with Angie Stone. Even though Angie Stone, she just passed, she was complaining about what royalties she wasn't getting. Now, I believe Angie Stone actually wrote her music, so she might have much more of a case. But after the departure of Peter Cetera, I didn't follow the group that much. Now, there were 2 or 3 albums that I purchased or listened to after that, which I liked. I mean, I like some of their music very highly, especially, I think, Chicago 20, Chicago 21. There's a couple of songs that I like very well. There's one called Look Away. There's another one they did on another album called Caroline, which I love that very much. So I think Chicago still was putting out decent music, but it just wouldn't be the type of music that would attract the notoriety and sales and airplay as they did when Peter was with them and when Terry was with them. But as far as seeing Chicago live, I did see them once more. I saw them in Las Vegas. They performed at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. I forgot what year it was, but I did see Chicago then. They had the big Jumbotron video screen. I remember I went, my family was, my ex-wife was with me, my daughter. I think my mother was with us and my mother's acquaintance and a couple of maybe my nieces and other people might have went. Because I remember I saw a couple of members of Earth, Wind, and Fire waiting outside the auditorium before we entered, the venue. I remember seeing a couple of members of Earth, Wind, and Fire there. I believe they might have been going to be honored that night. That's why they were there. But I wanted to come tonight again, inspired by the documentary that I saw. I said, let me give my take and give my kudos and honors, pay my respects to one of my favorite groups of all time, certainly in my early years, and that would be the group Chicago. So, God willing, I intend to come back and feature other of my favorite artists and favorite groups coming up. Chicago is just one. As I am inspired to do so, I will pay tribute and highlight other artists. But I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. Please share this video, like, and subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. Don't be a ghost watcher. And I don't ask for any donations here. I would ask you if you want to financially support me. I'm not asking for a donation. I ask you to go to my website, www.geecheelinemusic.com, or may still be reached at chilionsoul.com, and go buy some music. I have 20 or 30 selections there, albums and singles, where you can go download the music for as little as 99 cents. You can go there and download some of my music. That's how you can support me. I'm not going to be on here like a lot of these other vloggers waiting, for the super chats and donations and giving you my PayPal and all that stuff. And I'm not shaking my ass for nobody like some of these other women may do. Hoping that you thirsty guys out there will send them a donation. I ain't doing that. But I am a musician, a legit musician, and I have some music out there which I invite you to purchase. And that is your best way to show appreciation and support for me. And also, I'd like to say again, download the Fan Base social media app. You can download that app with Google Play as well as Apple Play. Download that app for free. Set up, create a profile for yourself. That's free. Once you have set up a profile, you can search for Geechee Line Music and Geechee Line Journey pages, and you can like those. Like them. Cost you nothing to like them, and follow my 2 pages there. If you would like to be a subscriber, you can subscribe to my Geechee Line Journey channel there. I believe it's only $4.99. And my music channel, once I get it set up, actually is $6.99. I'm going to have different items on there. Of course, it's going to emphasize music, whereas Geechee Line Journey is going to emphasize the other 3 cornerstones of my vlogging, which is travel, retirement, and culture. So thank you all for joining me. This is Geechee Lion Music. Join us again maybe next week for another feature of another artist. Thank you.